The plane tore through the storm as if the sky itself had opened to swallow it whole. Amelia clenched the armrests, her knuckles white against the leather. The small charter plane had seemed like a perfect way to reach the heart of the Amazon jungle, quicker than the usual river routes and a rare chance to witness the untamed beauty from above. But now, that decision felt like a cruel joke. Next to her, Mark was absorbed in his notebook, jotting down notes on geological formations he hoped to study. His calm demeanor was unnerving. Across the narrow aisle, Sophie fidgeted with her camera, adjusting its settings despite the plane's turbulence. The youngest in the group, Sophie had been ecstatic about the opportunity to photograph some of the rarest wildlife on the planet. She talked non-stop about pink river dolphins and golden lion tamarins until Amelia had tuned her out entirely. Up front, Jake, the pilot, kept his hands steady on the controls, his aviator sunglasses perched low on his nose. "This storm's a surprise, folks," he drawled, his voice casual despite the shaking plane. "But don't worry. I've flown through worse." The confidence in his voice did little to ease the tension building in Amelia's chest. Outside the small window, the world was a swirl of gray and black. Lightning forked through the clouds, illuminating the dense green canopy far below. The jungle seemed both mesmerizing and menacing, a vast sea of trees that stretched endlessly in every direction. Then it happened. A crack of thunder louder than anything Amelia had ever heard. The plane jolted violently, and alarms blared in the cockpit. "Brace yourselves!" Jake yelled, his relaxed demeanor gone. The cabin descended into chaos. Amelia gripped her seatbelt, her stomach lurching as the plane dipped sharply. Mark's notebook flew out of his hands, pages scattering like leaves. Sophie screamed, clutching her camera to her chest. Amelia glanced out the window and froze. The left wing was on fire. "Mayday! Mayday!" Jake's voice was frantic as he wrestled with the controls. "We've lost an engine. I'm looking for a place to land." "Land where?" Mark shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of wind and rain. "There's nothing but jungle." The plane plummeted, the nose dipping dangerously. Amelia felt her stomach in her throat as gravity took hold. The last thing she saw before impact was the canopy rushing up to meet them. Amelia awoke to a strange silence. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't truly quiet, filled with the distant chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the hum of insects. Her head throbbed, and her vision swam as she tried to sit up. A sharp pain in her side made her gasp. She glanced down to find a jagged cut on her abdomen, blood seeping through her shirt. Panic surged through her as the memories flooded back. The storm. The crash. The fire. She turned her head slowly, taking in her surroundings. The plane was unrecognizable, a broken skeleton of metal strewn across the jungle floor. Smoke curled lazily from the wreckage, rising into the dense canopy above. "Mark? Sophie?" Amelia's voice was hoarse, her throat dry. A groan answered her from a few feet away. She crawled toward the sound, ignoring the pain in her side. Mark was lying on his back, a large piece of metal pinning his leg. His face was pale, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. Amelia tried to move the debris, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me!" Mark rasped, his voice weak. "I'll find something to lever it off," she said, her voice trembling. "Just hold on." She staggered to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. The jungle pressed in on her from all sides, its humid air heavy with the smell of damp earth and burnt metal. She found a sturdy branch and returned to Mark, using it as a lever to pry the debris off his leg. Mark cried out in pain as the weight shifted, and Amelia winced at the sight of his leg. It was bent at an unnatural angle. "We need to splint it," she said, more to herself than to him. "And find water." Mark nodded weakly, his face etched with pain. Amelia tore strips from her shirt, using them to secure his leg with two sticks she found nearby. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. "Where's Sophie?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia glanced around, her heart sinking. There was no sign of Sophie. Or Jake. She called out their names, her voice echoing through the trees. Only the jungle answered, its endless symphony of sounds filling the silence. Hours passed as Amelia and Mark tried to make sense of their situation. Mark's injuries left him immobile, so Amelia took it upon herself to explore the immediate area. The jungle was overwhelming, its dense foliage and towering trees creating a maze of green. Every step felt like a battle as she pushed through vines and sidestepped roots that threatened to trip her. She found a small stream not far from the crash site, its clear water a welcome sight. Amelia filled an empty water bottle she'd salvaged from the wreckage and drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She returned to Mark with the bottle, helping him drink before refilling it. Night fell quickly in the jungle, the sunlight fading into a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. Amelia and Mark huddled together near the wreckage, using scraps of fabric and seat cushions to create a makeshift shelter. The jungle came alive at night, its sounds amplified in the darkness. Insects buzzed, frogs croaked, and distant howls sent shivers down Amelia's spine. "Do you think Sophie made it?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Amelia hesitated. "I don't know. She might have been thrown clear of the wreckage." Mark didn't respond, and Amelia could see the fear in his eyes. They both knew the chances of survival were slim. The jungle was as much an enemy as it was a lifeline, its beauty hiding countless dangers. Amelia thought of venomous snakes, jaguars, and the ever-present threat of infection from their injuries. "We'll find her," she said finally, more to convince herself than Mark. "We'll find her, and we'll get out of here." But as the hours dragged on, doubt crept in. The jungle seemed endless, its secrets hidden in the shadows. And somewhere out there, Sophie, or her remains, was waiting. Amelia woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The jungle was eerily silent, the cacophony of nocturnal creatures replaced by a heavy stillness. Mark was still asleep beside her, his breathing shallow but steady. She rubbed her eyes and tried to shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was both beautiful and disorienting, the endless sea of green giving no hint of direction or escape. Amelia's stomach growled, a stark reminder of their dwindling supplies. She needed to find food, and she needed to figure out what had happened to Sophie. She decided to venture deeper into the jungle, marking her path with pieces of fabric torn from her shirt. Each step was a battle against the undergrowth, her hands and legs scratched raw by thorny vines. The air was thick with humidity, and the buzz of insects was relentless. She spotted a cluster of bright yellow berries on a nearby bush, but her training kicked in. Eating unknown plants in the jungle was as good as a death sentence. After what felt like hours, she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a tree with massive roots that twisted and curled like frozen snakes. At the base of the tree, she found something that made her blood run cold, a torn piece of Sophie's jacket. Amelia's mind raced. Sophie was alive, or had been. But the torn fabric suggested a struggle. Her heart sank at the thought of what might have happened. She stuffed the jacket piece into her pocket and turned back toward the crash site, her pace quickening. When she returned, Mark was awake, his face pale and sweaty. "You found something," he said, his voice weak. Amelia nodded and showed him the piece of jacket. "It's Sophie's. I found it near a clearing. I think she might have been taken by—" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Something." Mark's eyes widened. "You mean an animal?" Amelia didn't respond. She didn't want to speculate, but the thought of Sophie being attacked by a predator was hard to ignore. "We need to find her," Mark said, struggling to sit up. "You're not going anywhere," Amelia said firmly. "Your leg's too bad. I'll keep looking, but I need to make sure you're safe first." She scavenged the wreckage for anything useful, sharp pieces of metal, seatbelts, even the remains of an emergency kit. With these, she set up a rudimentary alarm system around their makeshift shelter, tying the seatbelt straps to branches and attaching them to metal scraps that would clatter loudly if disturbed. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best she could do. Amelia ventured out again, her mind racing with a mix of fear and determination. This time, she decided to follow the stream she'd discovered earlier. Water was life in the jungle, and if Sophie was out there, she might have been drawn to it. The stream led her deeper into the wilderness, where the trees grew taller and the undergrowth denser. She was about to turn back when she heard it, a faint cry, almost drowned out by the sound of rushing water. "Sophie?" Amelia called out, her voice trembling. The cry came again, louder this time. She pushed through the foliage, her heart hammering in her chest. Finally, she found her, a small figure huddled on the bank of the stream, clutching her ankle. "Sophie!" Amelia ran to her, dropping to her knees. Sophie looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Amelia?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I thought I was going to die." Amelia wrapped her arms around Sophie, relief flooding through her. "You're safe now. I've got you." It wasn't until they were back at the crash site that Sophie began to recount what had happened. "I was thrown out of the plane during the crash," she said, her voice shaking. "I landed in a tree. It took me hours to climb down. Then, something started following me." Amelia and Mark exchanged a worried glance. "What do you mean, something?" Sophie shuddered. "I don't know. I didn't see it clearly. But it was big. And fast. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. That's when I fell and hurt my ankle." Mark frowned. "Could it have been a jaguar?" "Maybe," Sophie said, her eyes wide. "But I think it's still out there. Watching us." The thought of a predator lurking nearby was enough to put all three of them on edge. Amelia reinforced the alarm system around their shelter and scavenged for more supplies. She managed to find a small canister of fuel in the wreckage, which she hoped could be used to start a fire. Fire, she knew, was one of the best ways to keep predators at bay. As night fell, the jungle seemed even more menacing than before. The sounds were louder, more chaotic, and every rustle in the bushes made their hearts race. Amelia kept the fire going, its flickering light casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. Around midnight, the alarm went off. The clatter of metal on metal echoed through the darkness, and all three of them froze. "What was that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Amelia grabbed a piece of metal she had fashioned into a crude weapon and stepped toward the edge of the clearing. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Then she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. The glowing eyes seemed to hover in the darkness, unblinking and intent. Amelia gripped her makeshift weapon tightly, every muscle in her body on edge. The fire crackled behind her, casting just enough light to outline the creature's massive form. "What is it?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Amelia replied, her own voice steady despite the rising fear. She wasn't about to let panic take over, not now. The creature stepped forward, breaking the barrier of shadows. It was a jaguar, sleek and powerful, its golden fur dotted with black rosettes. Its muscles rippled as it moved, its gaze locked on the three humans. Amelia's mind raced. Jaguars were apex predators, and this one looked hungry. She knew running was futile. It would only trigger the animal's instincts to chase. Instead, she raised her arms, trying to make herself appear larger. "Back away slowly," she instructed, her voice firm. Mark and Sophie moved as quietly as they could, retreating toward the shelter. Amelia stayed rooted in place, maintaining eye contact with the jaguar. The fire flickered in the corner of her vision, and an idea sparked in her mind. She reached down carefully, grabbing a burning branch from the fire. Holding it aloft, she swung it in the jaguar's direction, hoping the flames would scare it off. The jaguar flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. Amelia's heart sank. This wasn't going to be easy. The standoff seemed to last forever, the jaguar's predatory gaze unwavering. Amelia's arm ached from holding the burning branch, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Just when she thought she might lose the battle of wills, a loud crack echoed through the jungle, a gunshot. The jaguar froze, its ears twitching at the sound. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the shadows, its footsteps silent against the forest floor. Amelia turned to see a man emerging from the trees, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was dressed in rugged, weathered clothing, his face tanned and lined from years spent in the wilderness. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. Amelia nodded, still clutching the burning branch. "Who are you?" "Name's Carter," the man said. "I've been tracking that jaguar for days. You're lucky I showed up when I did." As the adrenaline began to wear off, Amelia felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She and the others invited Carter to sit by the fire, grateful for his presence despite the mystery surrounding him. Carter explained that he was a biologist studying the local wildlife, though his rugged demeanor suggested he was more than just a scientist. He'd heard the plane crash and had been searching for survivors when he came across the jaguar's tracks. "You're lucky it didn't attack outright," Carter said. "It must be desperate. Probably injured or starving." Amelia shuddered at the thought. "Can you help us get out of here?" Carter hesitated. "I can guide you to safety, but it won't be easy. This jungle is unforgiving, and we're miles from civilization." The next morning, the group packed what little they had and set out under Carter's guidance. The biologist proved to be an invaluable ally, navigating the dense jungle with ease and teaching them how to find food and water. He showed them which plants were safe to eat, how to set traps for small animals, and even how to use vines to climb over obstacles. For the first time since the crash, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was tempered by the ever-present danger of the jungle. They had to stay vigilant, both for the jaguar and for the myriad other threats that lurked in the wilderness. One afternoon, as they crossed a shallow river, Sophie let out a sharp cry. "Something's biting me!" she screamed, thrashing in the water. Amelia and Carter rushed to her side, pulling her to the riverbank. Her legs were covered in small, bloody welts. Carter examined them carefully. "Leeches," he said grimly. "They're not dangerous, but they can cause infections if we don't treat the wounds." Amelia helped clean Sophie's legs with water from their canteens, grateful once again for Carter's expertise. But the incident served as a stark reminder of just how vulnerable they were. As they pressed on, the jungle seemed to grow even more hostile. Storm clouds gathered overhead, and the air grew thick and oppressive. When the rain finally came, it was torrential, turning the ground into a muddy quagmire and soaking them to the bone. Carter led them to a rocky outcrop for shelter, where they huddled together against the elements. The rain drowned out all other sounds, creating an eerie sense of isolation. "We're getting closer," Carter said, his voice barely audible over the downpour. "There's a village about 2 days' walk from here. If we can make it, you'll be safe." The promise of safety was enough to keep them going, even as exhaustion and fear threatened to overwhelm them. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that the jungle wasn't done with them yet. That night, as they tried to sleep beneath the rocky outcrop, Amelia heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the low, guttural growl of the jaguar, closer than ever before. The growl was unmistakable. Low, menacing, and far too close for comfort. Amelia's eyes shot open, her heart pounding in her chest. The others stirred awake as the sound reverberated through the shelter of the rocky outcrop. "Stay calm," Carter whispered, his voice sharp with urgency. He grabbed his rifle, loading it with practiced speed. "It's here." Amelia glanced at Mark and Sophie, who were wide-eyed with terror. She motioned for them to stay low, her own fear pushed aside by the need to protect her friends. The jaguar emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing like embers in the dim light of their campfire. This time, there was no hesitation in its movements. It was stalking them with a predator's focus, its muscles coiled and ready to strike. Carter raised his rifle, aiming directly at the beast. "If I miss," he said grimly, "run." Amelia tightened her grip on the makeshift spear she'd fashioned earlier, ready to defend herself if it came to that. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground beneath them, the jaguar lunged. Carter fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space of the outcrop. The bullet struck the jaguar in the shoulder, causing it to stagger but not retreat. It let out a blood-curdling scream of pain and fury, its eyes blazing with primal rage. "Get out of here!" Carter shouted, firing another shot that missed as the jaguar darted to the side. Amelia didn't run. Instead, she charged forward, her spear aimed at the predator's exposed flank. With a cry of determination, she drove the sharpened point into the jaguar's side. The beast howled, thrashing wildly as it tried to dislodge the weapon. Amelia was thrown backward by the force of its struggles, landing hard on the muddy ground. Carter seized the opportunity, firing another shot that found its mark. The jaguar collapsed with a final, guttural snarl, its massive body lying still at last. For a moment, the jungle was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the survivors. Amelia sat up slowly, her body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. "Is it dead?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter nodded, lowering his rifle. "It's over." But Amelia knew it wasn't truly over, not yet. The jungle had thrown everything it could at them, and they had survived. But there was still one final challenge: reaching safety. The next morning, they set out with renewed determination. The encounter with the jaguar had left them shaken but also stronger. They had faced death and come out the other side, and now nothing would stop them from reaching the village. Carter led the way, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. They crossed rivers, scaled rocky cliffs, and navigated dense undergrowth, their progress slow but steady. Amelia found herself taking on more of a leadership role, encouraging Mark and Sophie when they faltered and using the survival skills Carter had taught them to keep everyone fed and hydrated. After 2 grueling days, they finally emerged from the jungle onto a dirt road. In the distance, they could see the faint outline of huts and the flicker of cooking fires. It was the village Carter had spoken of, a beacon of hope in the vast wilderness. The villagers greeted them warmly, offering food, water, and medical care. For the first time since the crash, Amelia felt truly safe. As they sat around a communal fire that evening, the events of the past week began to sink in. They had faced unimaginable dangers and had survived against all odds. Carter prepared to leave the next morning, his work in the jungle far from done. "You're a fighter," he said to Amelia as they said their goodbyes. "Don't ever forget that." Amelia nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. We wouldn't have made it without you." As Carter disappeared into the trees, Amelia turned to her friends. They were battered and bruised, but alive. And in that moment, she knew they would be okay. The jungle had tested them in every way possible, but they had emerged stronger, braver, and more united than ever. Amelia vowed never to forget the lessons she had learned in the heart of the jungle, the resilience of the human spirit, the importance of trust and teamwork, and the indomitable will to survive. The jungle had tried to break them, but it had only made them stronger. And as they began their journey back to civilization, Amelia knew one thing for certain: they were survivors.